June 18th, 1812. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with tension. Inside the Grand Chamber of Congress, voices clashed like swords in battle. After years of rising hostilities with Britain, trade restrictions, impressment of American sailors, and British support for Native American resistance, President James Madison had made his decision. War was declared. Hundreds of miles away, in the bustling town of Baltimore, young Daniel Harper, a fresh recruit in the U.S. Army, listened as the town crier announced the news. The crowd roared, some with cheers, others with concern. Daniel's heart pounded. He had joined the army months ago, expecting a fight, but now it was real. "War, at last," said his friend Samuel, a fellow recruit. "Time to teach the British a lesson they won't forget." Daniel nodded, but felt a gnawing uncertainty. His father had fought in the Revolution, and the scars he carried, both on his body and in his soul, were proof of what war cost. But there was no turning back now. Orders came swiftly. Daniel's regiment was to march north toward Canada, where the first battles would take place. Across the border, in the British-held territory of Upper Canada, Lieutenant Thomas Caldwell of the British Army readied his men. Unlike Daniel, he had no illusions. Britain was already at war with Napoleon in Europe, and resources in Canada were thin. The only hope lay in their native allies, led by the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel's regiment set off, their boots thudding against the dirt road. Somewhere in the forests of Canada, Tecumseh and his warriors prepared for the fight ahead. The war had begun. July 1812, the American army marched north, their spirits high, but their supplies dwindling. General William Hull led the troops toward Fort Detroit, believing the Canadians would surrender easily. Young Daniel Harper and his friend Samuel joked as they trudged forward, unaware of the storm brewing ahead. Across the river, Lieutenant Thomas Caldwell stood alongside British soldiers and warriors of the Shawnee, led by the fierce and brilliant Tecumseh. Unlike the Americans, the British and their native allies knew the land, the forests, and the rivers, and they were ready to fight. One night, as Daniel's unit set up camp near the Canadian border, before dawn, the attack came. Arrows whistled through the air, followed by the crack of muskets. Chaos erupted as shadows moved swiftly through the trees. Daniel barely had time to raise his rifle before a figure lunged at him. A Shawnee warrior knocked him to the ground, but before the killing blow could land, Samuel tackled the attacker. "Move!" Samuel shouted, dragging Daniel to cover. Around them, the American line crumbled under the relentless assault. General Hull, rattled by the ambush, ordered a retreat toward Fort Detroit. Days later, surrounded by British troops and Tecumseh's warriors, Hull made a shocking decision. He surrendered without a fight. The Americans had lost Fort Detroit without firing a single shot in its defense. Daniel sat on the ground, defeated and humiliated. "We came to conquer," he muttered, "and we lost before we even began." Across the battlefield, Tecumseh watched the American prisoners with quiet satisfaction. The war was far from over, but the first victory belonged to him and his people. August 1714. 2 years had passed since the disastrous surrender of Detroit. The war raged on, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The British and their native allies had won early victories, but the Americans had struck back, burning York, modern-day Toronto, and securing key battles in the Great Lakes. Now, the war had reached the heart of the young United States. Washington, D.C., Daniel Harper, now a seasoned soldier, had fought in several battles. The fear he once carried had hardened into resolve. He had seen friends die, endured hunger and exhaustion, and now stood in the capital, awaiting the enemy's next move. The British were coming. On August 24th, British forces under Major General Robert Ross marched into Washington. The Americans, outnumbered and unprepared, collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg, leaving the city defenseless. Daniel and his regiment retreated with the rest of the army, forced to watch from a distance as British soldiers entered the capital. Then, the fires began. Flames consumed the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings. The sky turned red as smoke choked the air. Daniel clenched his fists. "We fought a revolution to be free of them," he growled, "and now they burn our home?" Nearby, Samuel spat into the dirt. "They won't hold it for long. This is still our land." Samuel was right. Days later, a powerful storm swept through Washington, dousing the fires and forcing the British to withdraw. The war wasn't over, but the Americans refused to surrender. Months later, in September, Daniel found himself in Baltimore, watching as British ships bombarded Fort McHenry. Through the smoke and cannon fire, he saw something that stirred his soul: the American flag still flying. The British, unable to break American defenses, retreated once more. By early 1815, peace was declared. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war, though neither side claimed true victory. But for Daniel, Samuel, and countless others, the war had proven one thing: the United States would not be broken. As he marched home, Daniel looked back at the battlefield one last time. The War of 1812 was over, but the fight for America's future had only just begun.